Welcome back to Fuel Up Classic. Now, if you haven't subscribed already, please do. It makes all the difference. And if you love classic cars of all different types, all different varieties, then I hope this is the channel for you. But today, I've managed to get two 1990s British V8 sports cars side by side. Now, the Marcos Mantara, if you're familiar with my other videos, you may know already that I have got to know this car very, very well. I've covered thousands of miles in it over the last year or so, and I just love driving it. But it is a car that is uber rare. They built just 137 Marcos Mantaras. And then there's the TVR Chimera, a car that I've always respected. I've managed to drive quite a few, and I know owners that have had these cars for years and years, got a great loyal following. And I think it's really easy, on paper at least, to pitch these two cars against each other. You know, in terms of the price that they were back in the 1990s, and even compared to the price they are now. Fiberglass body, Rover V8 powered, rear wheel drive, back to basics British sports cars. But they're actually very, very different. So I want to take both of these cars out for a drive now and just give you my personal opinion of what it's like to be behind the wheel of both of these cars and how they compare against each other. If you'd like to see full videos on either of these cars, I've done that too. But the idea with this one is just to put them side by side and just strip back some of the thoughts that you might have had that these cars are incredibly similar. They offer the same thing really on paper, it's just a different badge. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. So join me as I take both of these out for a drive. It's a tough job, but somebody's got to do it, and I'm really looking forward to this one. So join me for this, join me for more videos on the way as well, and I hope you enjoy this video. So there's one thing to be aware of in the Marcos, and I have become very, very good at navigating around speed bumps and that sort of thing. This car is incredibly low. Those rear exhausts sit just a few inches off the ground, and I would say, and I never thought I'd say this, the TVR overall has to be seen as a more practical car. Don't get me wrong, I love driving this car and I really love taking it long distances, but the ground clearance is an issue. These cars are incredibly low. You learn very quickly that you need to navigate every bump in the road. And that sort of brings me on to the next thing, the ride and the handling. Well, there's no denying the Marcos is a much stiffer ride. This car has had the common upgrade of having uprated dampers on the front, and it handles fantastically. It's confidence inspiring. You can really have some fun with this car, but the ride is much, much firmer. The TVR is softer. It's a much more composed and compliant car, I would say. This just feels more hardcore. You're sat down incredibly low, you're hunkered in. I have one of the most wonderful views over the bonnet here, those bulges all across the bonnet there, the vents. It just feels like more of a drama, more theatre to me in the driving experience of this car. I don't want to say the TVR is boring, because it isn't, but it is more conventional in the way that it drives and it handles and the way that it makes you feel. There's no denying that if you wanted a car that you could use every day, and you wanted a car that really you got out of and felt very, very relaxed, the TVR is probably the better option. Another thing to consider, and they both suffer from this, but it's definitely more apparent in the Mantara, the heat that soaks into the cabin. That big old V8 pumps out a hell of a lot of heat, and it finds its way into the cabin very, very quickly. When you've got the hood up in this, you almost always have to have the windows down. It gets baking hot in here, and I've mentioned it in my other video about this car, but this car did have the provision for aircon to be fitted. And if we had lots of hot summers in this country, or if I was taking this car regularly abroad, I would consider having air conditioning put into this car, because I just think it would make a world of difference. It does get very hot. Of course, the hood arrangement as well. I tend to drive this car 90% of the time with the hood down. The hood up is perfectly fine. It's quite hard to get in and out of. You have a tiny space to sort of almost maneuver yourself, contort yourself in and out, but I've sort of mastered it now. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty, but I found a way of doing it. But the hood arrangement on the TVR is better. It's almost like a Targa top arrangement. You can have almost the best of both worlds. Wind noise is more apparent in this car as well with the hood up, and you do get a few leaks in torrential rain. I would probably say on the whole, the Marcos offers the wilder driving experience. Just from looking at it, you know you're in for a wild ride. This is a rare car. I think it looks fabulous inside and out. Both on performance, on paper at least, they're both about the same really. They both are powered by the same engine, so it's no surprise there really. Plenty of performance, plenty of torque, great soundtrack. But the Marcos just requires that little bit more dedication. You need to be in love with this car to enjoy it. If you're not, you could find it a little bit tricky. But the great thing is, this is an uber rare car. If you're buying one of these, you're buying it because you want it. And that way you start to forgive the little things. You forgive the fact that, yes, these switches here are all nicked from Minis, and other little bits and bobs are borrowed from British Leyland and Fords and that kind of thing. I just don't care. I'm buying this car because it's uber rare, it's British, it's got an amazing pedigree behind it, a great backstory with Marcos and their racing heritage. And obviously now both TVR and Marcos are dead businesses. You know, there's talk of TVR being revived, but I'm yet to see it, and I don't think there's much hope for Marcos to be making a reappearance, but never say never, and I truly hope they do. But for me, every journey in this car is an event. It makes people smile, and more importantly, it makes me smile. But it is very different to the TVR. It's harder. You've got to be more committed to it. You've got to know what you're letting yourself in for. But if you do, and you go in with your eyes wide open, there's very few cars that reward you like a Marcos Mantara. And let's not forget that soundtrack. And I think now we're just waiting for the TVR to warm up a little bit. That it is a real privilege to have both these cars side by side, because they both represent, you know, an era of motoring that's pretty much gone now. We're very unlikely to see this kind of car built again. You know, big thumping V8s, no driving aids, relatively affordable even when they were new, let alone now. You know, it's motoring from a bygone era, even though it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. But let's talk about the TVR. Now, I have done a whole video on this car, so by all means, if you're interested, you can go and watch that. And I'm going to try not to repeat too much from that, because the idea of this is to compare it to the Marcos Mantara. And the most immediate thing, and I think you're going to pick this up at home as well, is just how much softer the ride is. I'm going over exactly the same road as I did with the Marcos, at pretty much exactly the same speed, but this is just much more softly sprung, softly damped. The seats are incredibly comfortable. You do sit quite a bit higher than in the Marcos, but so does everything else. That car is a real exception anyway. And it might surprise you, but the TVR is definitely a much better all-round package. Now, I use the word better because it really depends what you want from a car like this, and I think that's quite important when you put them side by side, is if you were in the market of buying a 90s V8 sports car, British sports car I should say, and those two cars came up on your radar, it's kind of understanding what you're going to do with it. Because the TVR is certainly a great all-rounder. As I said, comfortable. The cabin is really special. TVR, they got it right with these cars, whereas the Marcos does borrow lots of things from other cars, as I mentioned, and you know, it has its own unique eccentricity. The TVR is a whole other level. What they've done is throw away the conventional layout of a car in terms of, you know, the door handles. Well, they're not operated on the other side of the door at all. You press a button under the wing mirror. The window switches are hidden away behind here. If you want to open the doors, well, you twiddle this knob here in the middle of the center console, and they're just these quirks that TVR has become so well known for. But it actually creates not only a bit of theatre, a bit of drama, and reminds you that you're in a car that's really quite unique. TVR didn't do things like other people. And I would probably say, although they're both powered by the same Rover V8, the TVR is certainly louder on startup and idle. This car burbles away. It sort of creates that lovely atmosphere and tension before you take it out for a drive. But when you drive it, there's nothing intimidating about it, bar the fact that I find the clutch heavier than the Marcos, and I find the gear change much shorter throw, which I personally don't enjoy as much. Prefer the longer shift of the Marcos, but that's just pure personal preference. The great thing about the TVR is you can have a fairly sedate cruiser, but then drop it down into third, squeeze the throttle, everything comes alive. And this car's almost got like a split personality, whereas I think with the Marcos, you're always reminded it's something quite hardcore. You're always reminded that you're in something that is kind of like race car derived as such, whereas the TVR feels like it can give you a really well composed road car with the element of a race car in terms of the noise and how it feels. It sort of flips it on its head compared to the Marcos. So it does all come down to what you would use the car for. If you want to do really long journeys, you're going to find it easier in the TVR, that's for sure. But if you want drama and you want something that's just sort of uber rare, well, you go for the Marcos, don't you? You take it out for a blast and you have your fun and you put it back in the garage. The TVR, well, that's something that you could drive up to Scotland in a heartbeat, and you're not really going to feel like you've done too much hard work at all. It is surprisingly capable, this car. The boot is big and it's a good size. The cabin is spacious, even with the hood up. And you still get to surprise both yourself and any passengers with just how much punch this thing's got. But should you really be surprised that this is a more competent all-rounder? Because yes, back in the mid-90s, the Marcos and the TVR were priced at a similar price point, about 30 grand-ish, 30, 35 grand. But look at the build numbers. They made over 6,000 Chimeras. They made 137 Mantaras. And when you start to look at those numbers, you realise just how different the cars are. Of course the Marcos is going to be borrowing a few bits here and there. It's a much more wild car. It's much more eventful in terms of wherever you go with it. People don't know what it is. And those that do, they want to talk to you about it. Largely, most people know what a TVR is. It still commands a lot of respect, but it's more common. And that's the thing, you know, this outnumbers a Marcos Mantara many, many, many times over. So if you want the uber rare factor, and that comes with its ups and its downs, go for the Marcos. If if you want something that's still rare, but is a much more composed driving car that you can use on a daily basis and not live with the downfalls of a car that, you know, they produced less than 137 Marcoses, buy the TVR. It's a much more conventional car, even if it does have those lovely quirks that TVR are famous for. That's what it boils down to. Performance, I think it feels like you're going faster in the Marcos than you actually are. I think on paper these two are so similar in terms of those figures. It all comes down to what you want, and I think the grin factor. Now for me, and maybe it's because I'm just so well acquainted with the Marcos now, I'd always go for the Marcos. I've got a sort of special place now with that car. It's really grown on me. But if I wanted one that I could take someone else out with me all the time, and you could enjoy it at the weekends, do longer jaunts with it, I'd probably take a TVR, to be honest. So there we have it. The idea of this video was never to draw a conclusion of which one is better than the other. I don't think these cars deserve that, and I don't think there's an actual answer to that. It all comes down to what you prefer if you're thinking about buying one. But what I do think we've highlighted, possibly for the very first time, because there's not a lot of content out there on a Marcos Mantara, and I don't think there's any other videos that put them side by side against arguably its main rival of the day, the TVR Chimera. But they're incredibly different in what they offer, in how they look, and how they feel when you drive them. I have to say, for me, I'll always favour the Mantara. I've really grown to enjoy this car on every single journey I do with it. But the TVR demands respect. It's a great car. I think it's probably one of the best that TVR ever built. And as I hope I've highlighted, I think it is probably the car that if you want a great all-rounder, Chimera, fantastic value for money. If you want something that's uber rare and you want something that's going to stand out, and it's going to be a bit of a conversation piece, but it's also going to be that little bit harder each time you go out and drive it, but you're arguably going to have a bigger grin on your face, seek out a Marcos Mantara. That's my advice. Yours may differ, of course, but if there's anything you'd like to know about either of these cars, drop it in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer, or we can always do another video with an update to see if we can answer any of your questions at home that you might be interested in either of these cars. Thanks very much for watching.